The flange wall in sheet metal is an attached or secondary wall. That means that you have to start off a sheet metal part with a primary wall like planar or extrude, and then you can attach walls like flange and flat and other different ones like a twist wall to it. Let's take a look at how to create a flange wall. So we will click on the icon for it, and first we'll select our references. And here's one thing I always try to remember: you sort of want to pick the edge on the opposite side of where you want the feature to go. So for example, if I wanted it to create sort of on the top side of my part over here, I'd want to pick the edge on the bottom of the part. And here you can see a preview of the geometry before I start messing around with the drag handles and the shape of the wall. I want to show you selecting multiple references. And this is a big difference between a flange wall and a flat wall. With a flange wall, you can attach it to multiple edges at the same time. And the way that you do that is with the Shift key, not the Control key. So if I hold down the Shift key and hover over this particular edge, I can use one by one, and with that method I am picking up individual edges that I want. Let me clear my selection, and I'm just going to select my first edge again. And this time when I hold down the Shift key, if I move over here, you can see that I'm getting the tangent chain. If I pick that, you can see how it goes all the way around the model. Let's undo that. And I just want to show you that if you're getting, say, the tangent chain and you want a different type of selection, if you tap the right mouse button, it'll toggle between the other surface chains. So for example, surface loop from 2, and here's just doing the surface loop from 2, but going around the opposite direction of the part. And here I have the complete surface loop. And here's what's neat about that. If I just hold down the Shift key and put my mouse over the main body of the part, I can add the flange wall around the entire surface. But for what I'm going to show you, let me clear the selection, and I'm just going to select that one edge just to show you as I manipulate this. All right, now that we have our edge reference selected, you'll notice that there are some dimensions and drag handles on the screen. So for example, here I have the drag handle, and this allows me to change the height. Sorry for the screen flashing. This one allows me to change the angle of the wall, and the one down at the bottom allows me to make this what's called a partial wall. In other words, it only goes along a portion of that edge reference. And I'm going to leave that there for now. Let's take a look at the other different shapes that are available. And before I do that, I'm going to open up the Shape tab on the dashboard just to show you that you can see the different dimensions and actually change them from the Shape tab as well, and the graphics area will update. So right now I'm using an I shape, and it's just basically a straight line. Let's go to the drop-down list. There's also an arc shape, and if you zoom in over here, you can see that, hey, basically it's got an arc there and then a straight portion. And then we have the S shape, and after that we have a bunch of what are called hems. So we have an open hem. Let me zoom in over here. And then a flushed hem, and it's flushed on the other side of the part. Then we have a joggle, and the duck shape, and the C shape, and the Z shaped. And underneath that we have user defined, but I want to point out two other things. You'll notice that I have choices under here for lip and then teeth flange, and this is because of different config.pro options. If I go to File, Options, and then Configuration Editor, let me find first one, Sketcher Palette Path. Okay, so this is the Sketcher palette, and this is commonly used in sketch mode. So you could make a shape, and if you like it, you can save out a .sec file and then retrieve it again. And you can do the same thing with custom sheet metal wall shapes. So for example, if I go to my C palette Creo palette folder, you can see that it's got a few different SEC files in it, and one of them is actually applicable for placing in a sheet metal part. That's why it shows up in that drop down list. And the other config.pro option, if I go back to my Creo folder in here, you'll notice that I have a folder called Flange, and this one also contains shapes that I could use for flange walls in sheet metal. And in my config.pro file, I have an option set. Oh, there it is. Flange shape sketches directory, and it's set to, on my computer, C Creo Flange. And that way, if it finds any appropriate SEC files, it will allow you to use them. So let me cancel out of here. So that's why I have these two other different choices in here. One is in my Sketcher palette path folder, and the other one is in my flange sketch model or whatever directory, whatever that config.pro option was. And so that way I could choose it from the list over here. And there you can see I've got this weird sort of shape over there. And I was just messing around when I came up with teeth flange and made something really, really weird in there. All right, let's go back to user defined. And with user defined on the shape tab here, you can click on the sketch button. And right now it's showing, hey, do you want to sketch over on that? And let me click next, and it's dragged into my model based on the offset that I used. And if I click the sketch button, you go into sketch mode, and then you can sketch whatever shape that you want. So I'm just making couple lines over here. Normally I would change these dimensions, but for the sake of the demonstration, I'm not going to. From right mouse button functionality, I can use the check mark to get out of sketch mode. And so there you see the custom shape that I have created. And you'll notice here, even though I sketched in a straight line, I'm automatically getting a bend on the sharp edges. And we'll take a look at bends later on. But when I create this custom shape, I can click the Save As button in case I want to use this over and over again in other different files. And I can click Open if I want to retrieve a predefined shape that is located somewhere else other than where Sketcher Palette Path and that flange directory points. All right, for simplicity in the shape, let me change back to an I shape, and I'm just going to leave that there. Let's change. Well, I just make this a little smaller so I can show you some of the other different options in here. All right, when I dragged this drag handle off of the end of the edge, I ended up creating an offset, and that's what's controlled from this drop-down list. And by default, it's set to be out to the end of the first edge. With this option, you could use a dimensional value to drag it off, and you don't have to select that first. You can just drag it and it'll automatically be changed. And the third option allows you to select a reference like a point or a curve or a plane or a surface to drive where the end of that partial wall goes. And you also have the same thing on the other side. So I can grab this one and drag it out of value. You can see as I was doing that, it changed the number here on the dashboard. And as we'll see, those same values are available from the length drop-down menu. So just 3 different ways that you can get to changing your partial wall. You can do it either by dragging in the graphics area, or you can do it from the dashboard itself, or from the length tab. All right, I'm just going to change these to chain end for both of them for some of the other stuff that I'm going to show. Let's see, let's change to a right view for the next one. All right, and so I have my my flange wall created in here, and it is flush out with the surface. If I click to change the thickness to the other side of the profile, you'll notice that it's actually going to be out past the original length of the part. So just be aware of what the flip button does in terms of attaching the wall. And we'll take a look also at the offset tab. From the offset tab, this allows you to offset the wall with respect to the attachment edge, and by default is set to automatic, so it's assuming that you want your part size to be driven by the original size of the primary wall. But instead of doing that, you can change from automatic to add to part edge. And so that way the entire wall is being added onto the original shape. And in addition to add to part edge, you could choose by value, which will give you a drag handle, which allows you to move this into the inside of the part if you want. And this is especially very popular when you're using the offset. And I really like the preview that you get as you are manipulating your feature around. Okay, so there we have the different offset included in here. For what I'm going to show later on, I'll turn off in a moment. Okay, so the eye shape is a straight line, and you can choose if you're going to have a bend on the attachment edge. And if I go and turn off the option, you'll notice that. Let me actually get rid of the chain ends. Or turn chain end on. Okay, so here I do not have a bend on there, and you can just see it's rounded on the outside. Let's turn the radius option back on, and then it gave me my offset. Let's turn off the offset. And so by default, it is using a radius value of the thickness. If you go to the drop-down list, you can see previous values that are used, and also you can use some values that are based off of the thickness of the part, like the actual thickness itself, or 2 times the thickness, or you can just plug in what you want to use. So for example, maybe I want radius of 1, nice and big in there. And the next drop-down list controls whether you are dimensioning to the outer surface of the bend or the inner surface of the bend. And you're probably going to use the inner surface because that's what sheet metal manufacturers are usually going to bend to. That's a bend machine that they're going to look at. And also you could use the parameter value sheet metal default radius side. And I'll go more into some of these different parameters later on. All right, let's see. Next up, let's see. We took a look at the placement tab already. That actually we didn't, but here's the placement tab. It shows the different references that you are using. Already took a look at the shape tab. The length tab allows you to control whether you are chaining to the end of the references or you are offsetting them. And here's where you can offset, where you can attach to the part edge. Next option is grayed out edge treatment. And for that one, I'm going to hold down the shift key and select another edge in here. Oops, let me clear my references. And there we go. So now that I have multiple edges selected in here, from edge treatment, you can specify what sort of opening that you have in here. And right now it is using open, and open is in parentheses. Just keep that in the back of your mind for a second. I'm going to show you some model properties in a moment. When I go back to explaining some of these different parameters, and you'll see why this comes up in parentheses. But in addition to open, you could choose a gap, and with a gap, it's going to use the same value in here. I'm going to use a nice big value so you can see, oh yeah, there we have a really big gap inside of there. Instead of a gap with blind, you can specify distances that you want. You'll notice that it's using a value of negative gap on both sides. What is this gap that's listed in here? Again, I'll show you that in a moment when we go into the model properties. But again, I just want to show you that you can also go to the drop-down list and use a positive value for the gap in addition to a negative value, or you could use a thickness, 2 times the thickness, whatever. Just plug in the values that you want. And the overlap option makes a nice close corner inside of there. And when you do the overlap, you have the option of adding in a gap in addition to that. All right, So now that we have taken a look at the edge treatment in here for this particular edge, I just want to mention that you could have different edge treatments on different corners. So for example, if I hold down the shift key to add in another edge in here, we have two different edge treatments that we can address individually and configure however which way that we want. So for now, I'm just going to hit the check mark because I know I've been mentioning some different parameters and values in here. I want to show them to you right now. And the way that you get to them is from File, Prepare, and then Model Properties. And this is a command that I always recommend that you put in the Quick Access toolbar because it is very convenient. And so when you have a sheet metal part, inside of the Model Properties dialog box, there's going to be a whole section that addresses sheet metal properties. So for example, we've got bend allowance, which I'll mention in a moment, bends, relief, edge treatment, etc. And the nice thing is if you click the change button for any one of these, it's going to bring up a sheet metal preferences dialog box, which has all of them accessible inside here. So for example, there's bend allowance. Again, I'll mention that. Bend allowance is really something you don't have to mess with. Bends. So for the bends, here's the default value for the bend radius, and it uses a value of thickness. Or you could say, hey, I want a value of 2 times whatever the part thickness is. Or maybe you want something like 1/4 inch. Set that as the default. Here, the default radius side is going to go on the inside, and you have a default angle. For reliefs, you can set your default corner relief and bend relief, which I'll show in a moment. Here's edge treatment that we were just dealing with. And so the default value for that gap is 0.5 times the thickness. And again, you have a drop-down list where you could choose to use the thickness as the default gap value and 2 times the thickness, or again, just manually plug in if you have a value that you want to use, maybe like 1/8 of an inch or whatever. And miter cuts. Here's the default values for the miter cuts, and I'll show you the miter cuts in a moment. All right, so those are the sheet metal preferences. Let's click OK out of here and close that. And I'm going to edit definition. So we just took a look at the edge treatments, and I just mentioned the miter cuts. And to show you the miter cuts, I'm going to switch over to a different model. So let me open up. All right, so here I have a sheet metal part, and I created this with an extrude as the first wall. And here you can see that it's got a bend in the middle. And I will create a flange wall, and again, pick on the opposite side of where you want it to go. And this time when I hold down the shift key, let's get the tangent chain. And you'll notice that we automatically get a miter at this corner. If I go to the miter cuts, there you can see the gap inside of there. And again, it's using the default value of gap, but I can go and plug in a bigger value to whatever I want to use for the miter cut inside of there. And you can also control the offset. So that is the miter option when you're creating a flange wall that goes around a tangent bend in this fashion. Okay, let me hop back over to my other part over here, and the other things that you have on here. So from the relief tab, you can define the bend relief, and the bend relief, the default value for that is going to be rip relief. And from the drop down list, instead of rip relief, you could use a stretch relief. And you get the preview of it on the computer screen. Besides stretch relief, you can also do rectangular relief. And there you can see the rectangular relief being created. And you can change it from going up to bend to being a blind value, and then plug in the different dimensions that you want to use. Here it's using the default thickness. Again, you have other default values, or you could just plug in, hey, I want to use a value of 1/8 of an inch. Let's see, besides rectangular, you can do the ob round, which is basically like a rectangle that's rounded. So there you can see that we have the same relief on both sides. Instead, you could choose to define each side separately, and so side 1 relief, side 2 relief, etc. For the corner relief, let me zoom in over here. Right now, it's just using a V-notch in this particular corner. And again, you have a bunch of different choices, like you could do circular relief. There you can see a little circle that's being created, and a bunch of dimensions that you can plug in, rectangular, oblong, etc. Again, play around, figure out what you like to use. All right, the last thing to mention for the flange wall is the bend allowance. And so here we have the different bends in the model. The bend allowance by default is using part settings, but you could also have feature specific settings where you can set either the K factor or the Y factor. And this allows you to calculate the developed lengths that are necessary based on the material properties and the size of the bend and the different machines that are used to figure out what is the size of the blank or the flat metal that you're going to start out with, and then bend in order to create this geometry. Now, I mentioned this, my strong recommendation, if you're not a sheet metal manufacturer, you really shouldn't be messing around with this because you are not familiar with the different materials from the vendors or your different manufacturers' machines. Hey, just leave the default values based on the material and let your manufacturers figure out the bend allowance. And in general, you should just be using part settings anyway. All right, so I click the check mark, and there I have my flange feature created in the model on multiple different edges. I hope you enjoyed this video. For more information, please visit www.creowindchill.com. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up and click the subscribe button to be informed when new videos are added. Thank you very much.